Welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Messer, and I run One Pause, and this is Anne Waldman, who is the author of about 40 books and started Naropa Institute and the St. Mark's Poetry Project, amongst many other things. And so today we're just going to have a conversation. And I'm going to ask Anne 10 questions, and I ask all of our visiting poets the same 10 questions. Maybe some of you have been here before for that or not. And Aaron's laughing because he was asked these questions too.
I took issue
and
with
some
every
people don't like the questions, and because they're some can be very broad questions, and that's okay. And I also encourage the audience to interrupt if ask for elaboration, or so it can be more of a conversation. Also, we may not get through all the 10 questions, and then afterwards, Anne will hopefully sign some more books. And one thing I wanted to announce, which I forgot to announce last night, was she's giving a workshop this afternoon from 2 to 4 at Jewel Hart, and I believe there's still some spots available, and there's these flyers which are on the table. So that's a really amazing chance. So check that out. And I guess that's it. Thank you to Pot and Box and Metal for having us.
Yes.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. Here's the first question. What does it mean to make a poem?
Well, it's a process. It's a world. I mean, a very demanding, I would say, process at this point. I don't know that I can write small, discrete poems. Mm-hmm. So everything seems to be a long, very engaged process of, these forms that, yes.
Sail out there, 25 years.
And I mean, the current, I have to give examples because each project is so different.
Yeah.
So, this came out of inspiration to write an epic, and it seemed like a good form for my time. I was so obsessed with war and the wars of my lifetime, feeling that this was, the impossible conundrum. And then it was, interesting that they continued. I mean, in terms of where we are into the present, and I didn't know if it was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They were just having these wars so I could write my poem. In any case, that was, there was a lot of decisiveness around that. And so it meant a discipline, and I kept folders of certain areas around the poem, thematic things, that then information, clippings, articles, things that texts I was using, documentary texts, interview I did with my father when he was dying, things of that nature. So it meant it was an investigation. That's what it meant. It was an investigation. I was never sure where it was going to lead. I knew that the final thing would never be the complete experience, in a way. This current project is trying to be a little lighter and a little shorter. And Penguin, the publisher of this new book, has a new rule. They don't want anything over 100 pages suddenly.
Wow.
So it's just, I'm not even thinking about the length. I'll deal with that later, and I'll make a big case for it if it has to be over. So this new project is more of an allegory. Again, it's a kind of hybrid narrative. I read a little bit last night, the decider section. There's these various deciders that are determining the fate of the archive, and a doppelganger, Anne, who's in the dark castellum. It's a little bit of a Naropa allegory, perhaps, something like that, but not very much more. And so this involves getting into an exaggerated emotional state where I get, upset about the decision makers around things that have. So it's a little bit of a, personal allegory. And I think what it's a release for me. It's a story I've wanted to tell. I complain a lot about the decisions that are made relative to legacy and how things are within an infrastructure situations. I mean, maybe some of you deal with this in your projects in the world, just how they're received in the public sense and how close they are to the original vision. You don't want to compromise and so on. So I'm dealing with these ethical questions, I think, in this allegory. And then when it's, so there are different stages as well. There's the whole thinking about it, visualizing it in ways, hearing it, doing investigative work, get false starts. So we have to start somewhere, and then that often can be not the beginning, or it can be discarded. I think I've been through already probably 8 versions of this current project. So that it's the process then again, and then there's the procedure once it's looking like it's coming into production. How it's designed, and working with others on that, and releasing it into the world, letting go. I think the Manatee project I read from that last night was much more hermetic, and I didn't read, except for one section, the litany section, I wasn't really reading from it or talking about it much. And it was a more like a private meditation, and it had that quality of being, this sort of solo journey. I mean, it's always a solo journey, but I wasn't bringing it into public space until it was really ready. So does that answer the question?
Yes, that really does.
I don't know what it means to anybody. These things, I use the term cultural intervention. Like this book, Ethos especially, because it actually has this weight. It might be of use. You can sleep on it in a pinch. Use it as a doorstop.
Right. Okay, the next question is, what is the role of beauty in a poem?
The role of, well, I love beauty in poems myself, and to be on the other end of it, has these great healing powers. Things seem to coalesce and become more, you see these patterns that are somewhat antithetical to the dystopia I sense or feel like I'm living in a lot of the time. I put down the New York Times this morning saying this very question, where's the beauty? I want to hear some good news. I want to hear a beautiful story. I don't want to hear, finally they have something about a hawk, but it's hawks that have been poisoned by rat poison in Central Park. So on. So the role in the poem can be, you never know how it's going to be made. I don't think you can intentionally make beauty or inject beauty. You can have, an idea of yourself, what's beautiful to you. Of course, Gertrude Stein talks about how things become beautiful. They're seen as ugly, and then they're later accepted. I think it has to do with the balance and for me, I like the extreme conjuncts and sort of radical juxtapositions and shifts of voice, and I use the term too of modal structures. So when the modality, the vocal, the sound that I hear that I wanted to make, and then if I can in performance make that sound, and I want sometimes that sound, not just the hag voice, but the hungry ghost, but something a little more melodic. So I think it's, again, these different modalities I associate. Sometimes I think of music when I think of beauty in my own head.
That ties right into the next question, which is, how does sound and vision intersect in your poems? And I guess by vision, when I originally wrote this, I was meaning on the page. I was thinking of this thing that Nathaniel Mackey said, which was, how do you read a left-hand margin? So I was thinking about form, on the page. But other people have, because it's a really vague question, they talk about the image. So that's also in there too, in terms of, I guess, how are you thinking of a poem? Is it the sound and the voice that comes first, or is it the image, and how are they together?
This is often something, it's the first thing I ask in a workshop, how many people consider themselves, working with the melopoeia, the sound, the melody, the cadence, and so on in the language, or are they more phanopoetic poets? Are they image? Are they image driven? are they logo poets with the logic and the meaning and the, Ezra Pound says, the dance of the ideas, and for the image, it's the image cast on the mind's eye. So, from my point of view, all poetry has all three of those things going in different degrees and directions, and sometimes united in a way that the image has this kind of sound as well. And I think it varies with the specific parts of the text or textures. I see some parts as more performative on the page. Sometimes it's hard to notate exactly how I wanted in the John Cage section of the Eovis trilogy. There are these little, equal signs, which for me indicates as I'm reading it, Sprechstimme, which is spoke sung, the German spoke sung, and you hear that in some of Alban Berg and Schoenberg's songs, and song cycles are Sprechstimme. I mean, you hear it in opera as well, where things are spoke sung. So that, whenever I notate that way, and I started doing that a number of years ago, but it's also the language poetry, so that's sort of fun.
Right.
And that means I can go into this different kind of mode. And then there's this section of Manatee Humanity, which there's a line down the center, it's a duo, and I did a little bit of that last night, but it's, several voices overlapping at times. And so there's an indication of, a vocal arrangement with another voice, not necessarily sung or Sprechstimme. I would say sometimes the work comes to me as an oral idea, and especially some earlier pieces, a piece called Crack in the World. I actually heard a crack in the world. Endometrium shedding. I see the crack in the world. And a much, much earlier piece, Skin, Meat, Bones, where I woke up out of a dream and I heard these notes as sound. I heard these words as sounds. And I thought, this is it. This is the definitive poem of all time. It's all just skin, meat, bones. The outer surface, and then you get a little deeper in with the meat, and then it all comes down to bones. But to note, and I remember Allen Ginsberg saying, well, you should have to notate it in this particular poem in a certain way. And his idea was to have the skin in these kind of, trembly lines, and then meat should be these thick letters, sausages, and bones could be actual, bone-shaped letters. And there's a joke. But in that text, which I didn't publish, it was such an oral piece, and a friend of mine scored it for me, but then it varies when I read it. But she did a score for, I think, flute, but she wanted to do a version with flute. And then at the end, just when I finally published, I said, this is meant to be read in this way, where this is a higher note and a middle note. So does that answer the question? But then some pieces, these ideas, the manatee, humanity, when I met the manatee and took a vow, I'm going to include you in a poem, manatee. You're going to be my emblematic, endangered creature and stand in terms of a deity in this, replacing the Kalachakra deity the way the manatee was supposed to be doing that. There was a sense of the rhythms, trying to capture maybe the slower rhythms of that actual non-human elemental. And then in the litany, and then the manatee, humanity, the mantra, Om Manatee, Manatee, Padme, Om, humanity, Padme, just sort of uniting them in sound was the idea. So that was both, the idea, the vow, the creature, this sort of ecological, passionate work to some extent, and with the rage of stupid fuckers, and, that section. But it had started with this idea that then gestated, and there are always components, I think, that are oral and that way.
Right.
Any questions or any interjections?
I wanted to ask, actually, just about your thoughts about the poem on the page versus the poem read aloud, because your verse is so performative and it's so engaging when you read it. How can a reader approach it?
I see, yeah. Well, for me, it's both. It's always both, because I really enjoy making books, and I seem to have publishers who will publish them, which is a good sign. Because this comes up, are you an oral poet, page poet? I was part of a series called Page or Stage, and I said, well, I'm somewhere in between, I hope. But you know, the view, of course, is that the oral came first, in a way, and you could say poetry comes out of bird song and animal sounds, and the sound. Robert Duncan has an essay about how it's the growling of our stomachs and organs moving around, this internal symphony and orchestra that's going on. But I don't choose really, but I do understand that because I'm a dynamic reader who enjoys, playing with my voice, that sometimes it's, you aren't going to necessarily hear it that way. I enjoy being alive with the work, and I mean, it's wonderful for me when somebody can hear me and then appreciate the page more, but I can't do, and then other people have done their own interpretations and used things for their own, say, music project or even dance. So I want that kind of accessibility. I want it to be accessible to others in ways that they might shape it. Yeah? Oh, you're the charge.
To what extent do you find meaning emergent in work after you've written it, and how do you react to that?
No, that's interesting. I think I'm startled sometimes and feel like something was happening that I wasn't really aware of, and then it becomes clearer when I slow down, and have to be attentive to a text, or somebody's writing about a particular poem and has insight that I didn't necessarily see, but then it feels right. As a reader myself, voracious reader of others' poetry, that's always interesting how work changes over time. Things you return to, and you see things you hadn't seen before, certain conjuncts happen. I find it very true when somebody dies, a close, a poet friend, and then I look at their work I see it often or hear it in a new way. But I love that. The idea that there's some dynamic going on that you're not so in control of. That there's some mystery coming in from who knows where. But as you're putting together the sound and the meaning and the image and the words themselves that have this, the phones and phonemes within the individual words that have this quality and texture, not necessarily semantically, registering. That's not always important. The semantic meaning always, that the words are so bound to their meaning. But when that can be released, where it becomes, a sound or a new picture. Do you find that yourself?
Yes, I guess I was interested as to whether you either reveled in that or felt that it was, not what you intended and your reaction to that. But
no, I never feel tied to this is my only intention. Or I mean, unless somebody's reading the ethos, say, the overall ethos of something in some strange, negative way. This is not about supporting guns. This is about gun control. I have a piece, it was a section in Yoga's called Matriot Acts. And I talk about Matriot came out of the Patriot Acts, and I remember first, it was so hilarious. I'm going to write this thing, and John Ashcroft was coming to New York, to Wall Street. I'm going to go down there and read and there was a protest scene happening. I'm going to go read Matriot Acts. I knew that John Ashcroft was in the building to do this kind of magic thing on him. But at one point I'm saying, and I will ban all handguns. This is my first Matriot Act in my new government.
Anne, you mentioned on your new project you've been through 8 versions, which kind of begs the question is, how much revision do you do?
It varies. I mean, there's sections of the big long poem that were not so, the key to that was arranging. So the arrangement would change, but sometimes the certain texts, and then when I was working with any documentary material, I would, torque it and interrupt it, but it was, I didn't mess with it all that much, but it went through a lot of, changes and so on. Some of the chant work, more anaphoric, litanies, those tend to be less revised. They sort of come out in a more spontaneous way, and they're building, it's a very simple form, and I sort of trust the spontaneity and the following a chain of associations. So again, it varies, but I mean, I come out of the Kerouac school, and of course, as everybody is finding out, and we knew, Kerouac revised extensively. It took a lot of years to come to, there were versions of On the Road, a whole, section in Joual, French, and I mean, various processes that went on there, and then the interruption of the editors and so on. But Alan was very keen on this first thought, best thought, and actually what was meant there is it's the thought before you censor it. So it's not that it's your first thought, it's like it's the thought or before that. And he was recommending, this being more unbridled in your, less paranoid, and even talks at one point about, your mother saying, I don't want to hear that, or just be a good boy and go get married and go straight, get a job, throw a tie. So it's the thought before that kicks in. And the other time I like to trust that, and it's really fun sometimes to collaborate where you're really playing with the form. And in some Buddhist communities, well, Trungpa Rinpoche used to, you had to write up a spontaneous haiku, be on the spot. You have to stand up, and it was terrifying. You talk about the joys of spontaneity, letting it all hang out. Oh my God, the mind is completely frozen. And then you have the most trite line for a haiku, little frog on my knee. Leaps into my onion soup. That's too many lines, too many words.
Okay, this next question is totally shifting gears. What was the first poem you ever wrote, and what were the circumstances?
Tell me your secrets, O success. It is said your fruits are desired by ambitious men. Tell me, were I to something, blah, 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 would I be able to remain undaunted by dreams of more? I mean, just complete shock. But and I was young. Let's just put it that way. So that's my memory of, when a real poem that was sort of looked like a poem. Probably 11 or 12.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there were little doodles before that. But I was in an environment which encouraged, creative writing. I mean, in fact, back in those days, that it seemed like the public schools were, we had to write an Arbor Day poem, celebrating trees, occasional poems.
Great.
But I don't know, it was the actual first.
I love this question because, Clayton said his first poem he wrote when he was 3, and he remembered it.
Oh my God.
But then other people are like, I was 21, so, or whatever. So there's just this big range. So
Yeah, I don't think whatever I recite wasn't a poem. I mean, I wasn't seeing it as a poem,
Right.
but I remember this poetic thought, and it's amusing to me because of this ambition.
Yes. That's also interesting. Last week we had 2 poets, and both of their poems were like sparkly rainbow, I'm so happy. That was not my first poem.
What was your first poem?
Oh God, it was so depressing. It was about, there's a fence, it was a metaphor, there's a fence and people are between the fence and they can't get through the fence.
They got a whole book. I'm going to borrow it
It
from
was
my...
called Fences. Yeah.
Well, there was the Sandberg, Frost, good fences make good neighbors.
Okay, the next question is, talk about translation and your work. Any actual translation of language or the translation of experience, just the idea of translation.
Well, there's homophonic translation, which I've played
Can you
around
explain
with.
that
Well, that's
to people?
basically taking a text that's where you read, it's the sound, and then you translate from the words that you're hearing into. You can do English to English, and it's a sound translation. It's not from another language necessarily. And then there's taking text languages that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I like to hand out this Russian text to students often and ask them to translate. There's sort of Jared is just trying to find some kind of semblance of recognizable words, and it works. Arabic, interesting. So what immediately comes up in the mind, what you hear and see, and then you're always looking. It's fun to play against that tendency of always trying to find meaning or find the English word. In terms of literal translation, I've done a little bit from the French, some reverie, and worked with former student Laura Wright on, Jerry Rothenberg was doing with Pierre Joris anthology of Picasso's writings,
Right.
which Gertrude Stein said were terrible. I think she told him not to give up, he wasn't going to be a very good poet, but anyway, his voluminous texts of Picasso, so that was just the kind of word salady.
Mm-hmm.
So not having to have the the grammar was easier for me. I mean, I'm not so good with, I think, range of vocabulary, but not so good with because it's not a language I'm speaking and working with all the time. So that was interesting, very dense. Worked with Andrew Schelling on these translations from the Therigatha. The Therigatha, we called it the Sons and Daughters of Buddha, and these go back to the Pali Canon, but they're based on a whole oral tradition that went on for about 400 years before the poems were written down and codified into versions, and so they were often folk versions. But the nuns, the Therigatha nuns were amazing. I mean, I encountered them in a class I was taking with Judith Zimmer-Brand in Europa, and she said, you should do versions of these, and they were so passionate, interesting, and I think that the job there, the translation for me was getting the orality of what might have been, there was a little hint or taste or trail back to, some earlier versions. So they're rather loose and free, but because Schelling knows Sanskrit and had, familiar and done translation work, we were working with a version of that, the Prakrit. And so trying to get to the sort of orality, because it was this real oral tradition and sung tradition. There's some wonderful litany poems, a woman going through all her, I used to be this, I used to be that, but now I'm an old, hag. And I gave up. I mean, what you find with these particular texts is that these are not nuns in the sort of Western or Christian sense. Often there are people who had very full lives and later gave up. They didn't enter monasteries as young children or young women. Mm-hmm. So they had lived out in the world. They had difficult mother-in-laws and then lost family or suffered something and then turned toward Buddhism. Mm-hmm. So that quality too of release. There's one I really liked working with about, she's about to commit suicide, and she goes to the woods and there's the tree, and then it's not my throat, something cut, my mind was free. My throat was not cut, but my mind was free, so there's a cut to the mind. So, just trying to get the energy of this transformation. So I guess that's what interests me in translation, if you're using it more metaphorically, some kind of conveying or getting a quality of energy, juxtaposition, all those things anyway, the image, the sound.
Great.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
So what about your poems being translated into other languages, and if they are, do you participate in that process in terms of thinking about how to best do that?
Often I do when the translator's in touch, and I've worked recently with somebody in Germany, and there are questions of references, sometimes cultural references, and it's usually somebody whose work I've known a little, or they have a little bit of a track record with American poetry. Working with Vincent Roqueplois in Paris, he's translating Manatee into French, and I've been fortunate to see him over and had some readings in Paris, and so, and have him read with me, which was great, have him read his, the translations and work with him, and he's very careful and fastidious, and I think the poem itself somehow lends itself to that language, more so than maybe some other texts. I remember one question, I think it was from maybe somebody was doing a poem in Turkish. What is Naugahyde? You better just leave it, Naugahyde. I don't even know what it is. You can really attempt the chemistry of Naugahyde. But it's wonderful when somebody's, available and interested in working with you and has questions. And I'm delighted, of course, to be in other languages. There's sprinklings of various languages in the big trilogy. Kind of inspired by Pound's doing. I always love reading Pound. It's so, opaque at times. You just dead end. And what is that? And then you have the concordium of, the footnotes and so on you can go to. But I also enjoy just being, having your mind stop and puzzle something. And then it's, there's usually the embedded meaning is later. Comes with the image or the ideogram or whatever it is. There's some work being done in China, and that's harder. And there are, cultural, I think, not differences, but reference, certain kinds of references.
Sarah, can we take a brief break?
Yes.
Camera problem. Okay.
Okay. You want to repeat it?
Well, just to say, in, you asking about translations in other languages, but other kinds of texts like talks and essays, and this occasion of having things censored in China was around Tibet was, problematic. I was able to rectify it. I wasn't aware of it actually until later, but one can then have the private conversations. And in fact, in private conversations, everybody's very interested.
Great, so moving on. Talk about frustration, the time when you were perceived, a failure of language, if ever, in your work.
Well, there was a bit of a struggle finishing the Iovis trilogy because I had been with it so long. I mean, it was in and out of it, and there were these other projects I was doing, during it, and Manatee, and the structure of the world compared to a bubble, and marriage a sentence. I mean, everything the last 25 years also had, and often they were, wonderful sidetracks, relief. And so I thought I was going to drop dead if I finished the poem. I would just, it would all be over suddenly. And it was a strange kind of, weird fantasies about that. And then frustration about how to end. There were so many possible ways to end.
I was going to say, how did you know you were done?
I was telling Ken's class the other day, I took a walk in the foothills of Boulder and had this encounter with a snake. It comes in at the end of the poem, and it was a rattlesnake and doing this little, shaking. And my friend Peter Warshall, the biologist, had taught me this psh, 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 that you can do with any animal or bird, and pacify them and maybe even instigate a some kind of discourse or exchange. So I started making the sound of the snake, and in the poem I say ch 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 for the sound of the snake, and it seemed to it was shaking its rattle and doing the little things coming out. Calmed it down. It was in the crux of a tree, and I started saying, "You were the most beautiful creature." It was great, snake and so on. And then there were some runners going by, and it was getting twilight, and they went by. They were a little alarmed that there was a dangerous snake on the trail, and then I spent some time and then started to leave as it was getting dark. And as I was going down the hill, this huge woman was coming up with this big rock. "Where's the snake?" She'd heard about it from the runners. They said, "Beware, there's a lethal snake in the road." So she started coming up with her. She was going to kill the snake, and I stopped her in her track. It was like some mythic encounter. Brunhilde. She said Brunhilde. And so anyway, I decided that had to be the last sort of story out of my, there are elements in the poem of dream and all kinds of other genres and forms, but then there are accounts of, travel and some that are kind of one thread that's a more, personal. So I felt that needed to be the last sort of incident in there. And then my friend Tel Adnan had written a letter from Beirut. So there's the Code of Beirut, about Beirut being so much like America. And her being over there with, just the, because there's so much reference to the Middle East in the poem. And then ending outside in a way. And I have a reference to, an instrument of vision, looking up at the sky with a telescope. So I realized I had to end it outside. But frustration, yeah, it's just, it's never quite enough doing it all, everything you would imagine would go into it is not all there. It's too long.
What advice would you give to high school students who want to write poetry?
Read poetry. First of all, read a lot of poetry and develop some kind of discipline where even if you don't finish things or write something that you like or think is any good, just start a kind of daily practice. Have a notebook with you at times or all times. Keep a notebook by your bed. Do some dream. That's a good way to, I think, because everybody dreams and some people remember them more clearly and vividly than others, but that would be a way to, so that you have something. Just I have to always be so conscious. And so I would say the practice and then I don't know what the school provides, but you can often get things going. A little reading club. I mean, I did that kind of thing. A little reading club or getting together with friends who have a mutual interest at somebody's home and reading, picking a poem and talking about it. I mean, it sounds so nerdy, but turn off the television and the games.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
He's a high school teacher.
Oh.
So, yeah, because I have a lot of high school students that are sort of engaged in those processes already.
Right.
So when you have students that are like moving up to the next level and they want to get to the point where they really want to take the craft seriously and they really want to engage in it, what are the kinds of things that you really try to inculcate in students that are trying to go up to that next level?
Well, I think, again, the reading is so important, and there's some wonderful books. Just even the Poets and Teachers and Writers has done a series of books to working with kids, and I've been part of one called the Handbook of Poetic Form, edited by Ron Padgett, which is a terrific resource, and it has very traditional forms, but exciting forms and performative, more contemporary forms, and talks about found poems and slam poetry, performance poetry and so on. So that level of stuff, looking at form and getting, we're all going to write sestinas today, or something like that, and have examples. And then encouraging the little extra, the extracurricular thing, a little magazine, where then you start to see one another, see how it looks, but there's a process of formalizing it a little more, and I think the care to the manuscript and the care to the attention of, this is what you want somebody else to see. I think that can take it to a next level beyond just the thing in the notebook. And then I think, there's some wonderful videotapes of poets reading and visuals and documentaries. That series some time ago, that Poets and something, that ran on PBS.
The Bill Moyers.
Yeah, the Bill Moyers. The Pound and the Williams and there's a number of those I think are useful, so that they see that poets had lives and struggles, and it wasn't always easy. And then to talk about the lives of, say, Emily Dickinson or poets of the past, I think is important, because there's I found when I've gone into grade schools you know, there's an idea you have to be crazy to write poetry, or you have to be, you know, really weird and eccentric, and so, I mean, and that can be true, and so you are a little off the grid, but just the range of possibility, things like you know, some of the Oulipo strategies or New York School strategies. I mean, I think, you know, being able to go to a museum and ask everybody, pick something to look at on the wall and then respond to it and write something off that. Thinking of ways to trigger, you know, prompts to get things going. And that it's not just sitting there either with a, you know, a laid out form where you have to push and push on, what am I going to say next? You know, that there are ways to respond to the, you know, the world around you, and, you know, some students might be more interested in a political thing, I mean, writing a rant or writing a, you know, I think the collaboration, developing strategies within classes. Do you get to have a session where it's just poetry, or?
Yeah, definitely.
You can do that.
I guess I'm kind of really interested in, like, when you have students that are coming to the Naropa Institute, like, what is the core thing that you really want them to walk away with? Like, here's what's going to help you grow.
Well, they're already, yeah, we've had high school students, you know, some that are slightly, you know, ready to be in, I mean, it's an intense program, but I think that they have an engagement with a practice, that they're, you know, that it's that they're in the mind of it in a kind of daily way. It's not so separate from your life. Now I'm going to write my poem. I think that's really key. That they are open to, you know, one another's work. That there's a non-competitiveness is so important from my point of view. All the projects I've been with and worked with and helped develop and create are been non-competitive. And I think this is so important in these times when these are threatened, you know, forms, and the support for writers, as we know, is so minimal. I mean, everybody has to have another kind of job, and nobody, I mean, that's the other point, nobody's asking you to write poetry. Nobody's saying, well, write this 1,000-page book, and we'll be happy. You'll make the world a better place. I mean, you really need some confidence and some discipline and a practice, because you know you can have all the most amazing, interesting ideas and not be able to work them. So the dailiness. I mean, I tell graduate students 2 hours a day at least. I mean, when you're on a roll and you're really working on, say, a manuscript and something, that's even more. But that 2 hours, even if you're not working on you're reading, you're thinking about poetry, you're reviewing something, you're looking at a draft you did, or you're starting something, you're responding to another writer. And it's hard. 2 hours is a lot of time. But when you think about 2 hours, how we spend our time, you know, certain kind of priorities. But, you know, they should look at once they're out of high school. You know, there's a place like Naropa, I think, is really encouraging because it works with beginners. It's a very supportive, almost intergenerational environment, and lots of ideas about how to keep it going.
Great. Okay, so shifting gears again. So there's the famous line by Adorno, which he later retracted, "To write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric." And then this was countered by Jerome Rothenberg, who said, "After Auschwitz there is only poetry." So is there anything that poetry can't approach, in your opinion?
Probably not really, but I'm sort of on Jerry's side of that, and I think I know he retracted it, but the initial idea is like we need more of a way to work creatively with our existence. And what Alan and I developed in Naropa was the view that what is the goal of poetry? What is the point of poetry? It's to wake the world up to itself. That's sort of the essence. So in any way that you can wake the world up to itself, whatever the difficult knot is, there's I think a permission to do it, or a need to do it, or urgency. been working on a libretto for the music, we're working with Stephen Taylor and others, performers. And we've taken on Ezra Pound as this knot. And we put his usury canto to music, and this beautiful Renaissance trio thing that Stephen has created. The whole thing opens in a casino, sort of a little hint, or resonance with usury and contemporary reality and the Morgan Freeman, Goldman Sachs, all the chaos that we're in. Then we also use his horrible fascist broadcasts and look at those. So it's the knot of Pound. How can you write, some of the most beautiful lines in the piece and cantos for my money and then be this, horrible racist, and those texts are so hard to listen to. So we try to bring both, which is the sort of negative capability idea in the mind of the poet, in the mind. The idea is to be able to hold in the mind disparate things without any irritable reach after fact or reason. I mean, you're going to have a reason and your own conclusions about things, but to present the dichotomies and the contradictions and so on. So in that spirit, I think you can, work with, and I was trying to think, there's some of the most hideous things coming out of Pound's mouth here, and we're not trying to make them sweeter, we're just trying to show, this contradiction. Why have poets or artists been drawn to fascism in some instances? His love affair with Mussolini. So it's a kind of investigation of, a continuing situation.
Mm-hmm. You sort of jumped into my next question already, which was just to talk about the future of your work and what's on the horizon.
Well, this still working through this new manuscript a bit, and then the project with Stephen, we did a little in-house sort of version, a salon version. We're trying to do it again. I mean, it's expensive because it's, we need some readers, singers, this Renaissance trio, people trained in that way, cellist, keyboard. We worked with Marty Ehrlich, who's an incredible reed player, Ha-Young Kim, the cellist, but for rehearsals and so on. So it's a matter, you have this production, and we have the script is really complete, and the music is more or less complete, but then, how to take it to that next step. So it's rather ambitious. And then the Gossamer is the name of the new book. And I sort of came up with this version last week, and I think I'm just going to let it sit for a little bit and then look at it towards the end of the month and take it from there. And then Naropa's looming large on the horizon. So a lot of my work is also, these communities and cultures, and call it infrastructure poetics, where, attending to the details of how to keep a community together. And it's a degree program part of a degree program for some of our students, and it's also available to non-degree and people from other schools, and so there are different levels of attention, and have a magnificent, she's really the administrative director, Lisa Berman, who's been keeping that in together pretty well. But I've been the curator and artistic director, so that's coming up, and it's always a little, once it's designed, I think there's still some Naropa catalogs. I look at it and I say, isn't it enough? Now do I have to live through it? I've already heard it, seen it in my mind. It's like the poem is in the catalog. I mean, I could read it aloud to you, but actually living through it with 200 students and 60 guests arriving, every week a new constellation. So I need to start working out and eating well, and swimming, taking hikes.
You mentioned some of poly poetry that you're going to figure out what you call that. I'm interested in very old poetry that you find interesting or inspiring.
Well, I did, done some research in actually more, anonymous traditions, and worked with a Naropa program in Indonesia, where we looked at the theater. I mean, they don't have poetry, so it's not separated out really from performance and different kinds, but there's one particular text that interests me, the Chalangarang. It's really like, a ritual text with these different protagonists and allegorical in a way, and it's an all-night performance, and it ends in a graveyard, and so it's a, it's a experience and cathartic and so on. So that's interested me, texts that reflect that and actually have this vibrational orality that it was you feel these were enactments. Charles Olson uses the term enact, the enactment of the poem. I love the epics, and I was so into epics around the Eovis project myself, and from Gilgamesh to looking at some of the Nordic stuff and the Yugoslavian, and the view of the epic and its various tropes and how it is a communal public form, and so that I'm with you, and I'm not sure where your interest is taken
Well,
you.
you've touched on
Yeah,
some of that.
and then these Buddhist texts were also anonymous and are used they're part of the Pali Canon, so they're used as scripture in a way. I mean, they're part of that. It would be like the Bible's, the Songs of Solomon or some of the Psalms and so on. So, interested in syncretic texts that have a syncretic quality, and maybe a number of traditions are at play. The 9 shaman songs that have been translated by Whaley and others. I've often wanted to do my own versions of those. And going back to also these runic kinds of situations where you don't know quite what it is. There's a poem by Olson's called The Kingfishers, and he invokes the omphalos stone, the Greek omphalos stone, the E, and what is that E? And, so little shards and fragments that you can play with yourself in an imaginative way and think of versions. This poem was inspired more immediately by the Aeneid to some extent, and the Virgil line, Novus omnia plena, and the Latin, and see Latin is, the warrior tongue of empire, and, we're supposed to be like Rome here in America, so there's a little resonance with that. But no, I encourage just, the wonderful, from something like Jerry Rothenberg's anthology of Technicians of the Sacred, which is also contemporary, and I think that view of, the mind of the poet, all times are contemporaneous, which is Pound's line, but that's the view of the primitive and the the archaic and the contemporary, and so much of modernist poetics and poetry. And I mean, we had the advantage in our time of these discoveries, the Rosetta Stone, the Champollions, cracking the Mayan code, and so on. Whereas the Romantics, it was still sort of romantic. They didn't, these things had not been deciphered or figured out exactly. They're more artifacts. Whereas I think for our time, we can, we have more insight and scholarly work and science on what the meanings are. I mean, it's still very mysterious.
Are you familiar with those digs in Turkey where they're dated back to, I think it's 20,000 years? And
A little
decided
bit,
that
yeah.
It was really religion that drove that, not
Right,
some communal or militaristic.
right, exactly. Are they the ones near Anatolia? Is that the?
Thinking, southern Turkey.
So, okay. Well, I'd like to know more about that.
Okay, last question.
Oh.
There's one more question. So One Pause is named after Ikkyu Sojin, who lived in the 1400s in Japan, and was really responsible for this revolution of art, and no theater and rock gardens and calligraphy and poetry. And at that time, a person wasn't considered human if they didn't write, read, and have a knowledge of poetry. Some people have a problem with that statement. My friend who's 12 said, "I think most writing is inhuman." But
Really?
she said that, yeah. But anyway, I guess my question is, what can we do, I mean, it's ridiculous to ask you this because you've been doing it your whole life, but to make poetry more the case in America? You know what I mean? Like just more.
Well, some of the, I think teaching, education is so important. I mean, this, with the cutbacks of the poetry in the schools programs are really sad. I think poets should get into schools and do stuff, volunteer stuff, or offer workshops and other kinds of community projects. I think that's really important, starting when people are young. And there are terrific anthologies out there. Even when you have to give a child a gift, give them a book of poetry. In public space, I've always been involved with projects that are kind of outside the normal institutional structures and have that kind of institutional support. So I've been involved with things that started themselves. The poetry project started with a grant under Lyndon Johnson from the Office of Economic Opportunity to fund and help alienated youth on the Lower East Side. And we fit that category. And it was a sociologist from the New School who had this bright idea. And then the grant would include film and theater. So Theater Genesis, which had already been going on and doing Sam Shepard plays and others, it was already in place. The readings had been already happening, open readings at St. Mark's, and then the film, there had been this film series that I had gone to when I was probably 18 or 19, showing the Andy Warhol's Sleep and Empire and all these avant-garde films in the church itself, St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. So St. Mark's was already a culture place and had been used. Isadora Duncan had danced there, Harry Houdini had given a magic show, Frank Lloyd Wright had lectured, so it had some history, and it was interestingly placed. It was a very dynamic area, the Lower East Side, with all these immigrant histories and families and so on. So, natural place to start, and suddenly there was this little, money grant. They were hiring, and I was first an assistant to Joe Oppenheimer for the first 2 years, and then I became, because I seemed to have some energy. I was just out of college. And then I became director by 68, and then we had amazing freedom, and I realized I was looking into some teaching work in New York, and I realized I had not had a job interview since the poetry project, because I've been creating my own jobs. It was just really fun. And Naropa, likewise, invited out to give a summer festival, a one-shot kind of thing, and Alan and myself and Diane DePrima and going out to basically read and work with students, and I'm very happy that my papers are with Peggy out here in the Hatcher Graduate Library, because I can't remember some of this, but I went there yesterday to find one of the documents that Allen Ginsberg and I and a writer named Michael Brownstein had put in writing about our vision for the Jack Kerouac School in 1974. But in any case, we had nothing. And we had, thus the name, disembodied poetics, We didn't have an office, we didn't have, there was no plan, we didn't own a building, we didn't have stationery, we didn't have a desk, a telephone, etc. So I used to joke about a hank of hair and a piece of bone, and this is how you start a poetry school. But we had this vision, and John Ashbery's line, "The Academy of the Future is opening its doors to us." So I guess, and I tell younger people who, there's no money and it's so expensive to do this here and there, and et cetera, but there's still cities in this country and where you can find storefronts and you can try something, rent it for a while. I've been trying to get something going in Denver, and finally I think some of the graduates of the program might take that a little further. At one point there were places being, in Denver anyway, old schools and firehouses and so on, just being given to arts organizations in these abandoned buildings, and of course a lot of those are gone, but you can still find things like that. So encouraging, if people are really passionate, teaching I think is important for writers, and it's something they can do. Infrastructure work, create a reading series, create little online magazines, keep conversations going. And in a way, people think I think the poetry scene is somewhat healthy. It's a very exciting time for poetry. Amazing work out there, incredible work of you know, people I feel coming after my generation, you know, and even younger, and much more liberated and experimental and in interesting ways. The look and feel, in some cases the performative aspects. It's a very exciting time. I hate to see it all inside institutions and everybody's teaching in the MFA programs and they're on these career tracks, and that's hard, but it's also, you have to see it as a safe haven because there aren't a lot of other alternative places. But I'm really for this idea of the temporary autonomous zones, which is Hucking Bay's phrase, where you don't have to become an institution forever and ever and ever. You can have something that exists for 10 years or 20 years or 5 years or 3 years. That's important, that you could liberate spaces for people to gather. And something like this space that's now working with your series, this is so helpful and exciting, possible. So seeing those possibilities, it's good to work with others. It's very hard to do some of this on your own, to keep it going. Keep a certain rigor of standards and online, the whole technology thing. I mean, my contracts now say, and you're giving rights to forms not even invented yet. I want the microchip for the EOFIS. I want it to be on a microchip, and then if you want to buy my book here, you put it in your little sleeve, and then you can take it out.
Well, thank you so much. It's so
Thank you.
generous for you to talk for so long to us, and maybe we'll just have it be informal from now on, and because I don't want to wear you out, and if people want to have her sign books, I think you might
Sure.
want to do that.
Thank you all for coming so
Thank
early.
you very much.